Emma Clarke sat beside the dying man in room 317, gently wiping his fevered brow with hands worn raw from double shifts and student debt, never knowing that the frail widower she had just married in a stark courthouse ceremony was Richard Thornton, founder and sole owner of the very hospital where she scrubbed floors between caring for patients nobody else wanted. She had agreed to become his wife, thinking she was inheriting nothing more than a dying man's modest pension, a final kindness to ease his lonely passage from this world. But Richard had checked himself into the charity ward under false pretenses, a billionaire disguised as a pauper, searching for one last answer before he died. Could anyone love a man when they believed he had absolutely nothing left to give? Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Emma Clarke's reflection in the nurse's station window at 3 in the morning told the story. Her smile tried to hide. Dark circles carved beneath green eyes that had once sparkled with the dreams of a girl who believed nursing was a calling, shoulders that slumped under the weight of 16-hour shifts, strung together like links in an endless chain. 28 years old, and she felt ancient. The student loan statements arrived like clockwork, $53,000 that haunted her mailbox each month, in demanding payment, while her mother's medical bills piled higher on the kitchen table of their tiny apartment in the run-down part of town where sirens sang lullabies through paper-thin walls. Emma was 3 months behind on rent. Mrs. Chen, the landlord, had stopped knocking, but the eviction notice taped to the door last Tuesday spoke louder than any conversation could. Still, Emma tied her worn sneakers each morning, the left sole separating from the canvas, and walked the 4 miles to Mercy General Hospital because the bus fare was $2 she could put toward her mother's medications instead. She moved through the halls with quiet grace, stopping to adjust every pillow, to hold every trembling hand, to listen to every story that patients told when the pain medication made them chatty and nostalgic. The other nurses grabbed coffee and complained about difficult patients. Emma just kept moving, kept caring, kept giving pieces of herself to strangers who would never know her name after they left. Her supervisor found her restocking bedpans in the supply closet at the end of her second consecutive double shift. "Emma, we need you on the charity ward. New admission. Terminal case. No family, no insurance. Room 317. Emma nodded, her body screaming for rest, her heart somehow still finding room for one more person who needed her. She had no idea that walking into that room would change everything. Room 317 was the smallest on the charity ward, tucked away at the end of a corridor where the fluorescent lights flickered and hummed with electrical fatigue. Emma pushed open the door, expecting the usual scene of institutional bleakness, and she was not disappointed. A single bed with sheets worn thin from industrial washing, a plastic chair, a window that looked out onto the brick wall of the adjacent building. But the man in the bed made her pause. Richard Thornton lay propped against pillows that had gone flat years ago, his body ravaged by illness, skin hanging loose on bones that seemed too fragile to support even his diminished weight. 67 years old, according to his chart. Terminal lung cancer, stage 4, metastasized. Weeks, maybe days left. No emergency contacts listed. No insurance. No visitors since admission 3 days ago. Yet something about him caught her attention, held it. His silver hair, though thin, was neatly combed. His hands, resting on the blanket, were clean, fingers long and elegant despite their tremor. And his eyes, pale blue and roamy with sickness, held an intelligence that illness had not managed to dim. He watched her enter with the wariness of someone who had learned not to expect much from the world. "Hello, Mr. Thornton," Emma said softly, approaching his bedside with the gentleness she reserved for the most fragile souls. "I'm Emma. I'll be looking after you." He nodded, said nothing, but something in his expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or simply relief that someone had bothered to speak his name. Emma checked his vitals, adjusted his IV drip, noted that his dinner tray sat untouched on the bedside table, the food congealed and unappetizing. Her shift had ended 20 minutes ago. She should go home, should collapse into bed, should save what little energy she had left. Instead, She found herself pulling up the plastic chair. "Have you eaten anything today?" she asked. Richard shook his head slightly. Emma stood, her decision made. "I'll be right back." She returned 15 minutes later with real food from the cafeteria. Warm soup, fresh bread, coffee that was actually hot. She sat with him while he ate slowly, and they talked about nothing and everything, two strangers finding unexpected comfort in the late-night quiet. The days that followed formed a pattern that surprised Emma herself. She found reasons to pass by room 317 during every shift, bringing Richard water before he asked. Adjusting the blinds to catch what little sunlight penetrated the narrow window, staying after her rounds to sit in that uncomfortable plastic chair and simply talk. On her days off, when exhaustion should have kept her home, she came anyway. Arriving in jeans and an old sweater instead of her scrubs, carrying books she thought he might enjoy, or magazines from the hospital gift shop that she purchased with quarters saved from skipped lunches. Richard spoke little at first, but he listened with an intensity that made Emma feel truly heard for the first time in years. She learned he was a widower. Margaret had been her name, and the way Richard's voice softened when he spoke of her told Emma everything about the depth of that loss. 7 years since cancer had taken her. No children, no siblings, no one left who remembered the man he had been before grief and illness had carved him down to this fragile shell. But when he asked about Emma's life, his questions were thoughtful, precise, the kind that showed he genuinely cared about the answers. She found herself confessing things she had never told anyone. The overwhelming weight of her mother's medical bills, the shame of the eviction notice, the bone-deep exhaustion that had become her constant companion, the fear that she was failing at everything that mattered. Richard never offered empty platitudes or false reassurances. He simply listened, nodded, understood. The other nurses noticed. Jessica cornered Emma by the medication cart on a Thursday afternoon, arms crossed, judgment written across her face. "Why do you waste so much time on him? He's nobody. No family, no money. Probably going to die any day now." Sarah chimed in from behind the desk. "Seriously, Emma, you're killing yourself for someone who can't even tip you. There are patients who actually matter." Emma felt anger flash hot in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Every patient matters." She walked away before they could see the tears stinging her eyes, before they could know how their words had cut. She returned to room 317, where Richard waited, and somehow that small bare room felt more like home than anywhere else. The third week brought the decline Emma had been dreading. Richard's breathing grew labored. Each inhalation a battle his weakened lungs were slowly losing. The cough that had been occasional became constant, racking his frail body with violent spasms that left him exhausted and pale. Dr. Winters updated the chart with clinical detachment. Deterioration ahead of expected timeline, perhaps 2 weeks remaining, comfort care only. Emma read those words and felt something crack inside her chest. The hospital administration had different concerns. Mr. Hendricks from billing appeared at the nurses' station on a gray Tuesday morning, his suit too expensive for the stark surroundings. His expression carved from stone and spreadsheets. "Room 317 needs to be discharged. He has no coverage, no means to pay, and we need the bed for patients who can actually benefit from acute care." Emma looked up from her charting, disbelief turning quickly to anger. "He's dying. Where exactly do you suggest he go?" Mr. Hendricks shrugged, unmoved. "Social services can find him a shelter. This is a hospital, Nurse Clarke, not a hospice. We have a business to run." Emma fought them. She filled out forms, made calls to social workers who had no solutions, begged supervisors who had no authority to override billing. Richard remained, but the pressure mounted daily. She began using her own money, what little she had, to make his final days bearable. $15 for a decent pillow from the discount store, because the hospital ones were thin as paper. $20 for lotion that did not smell like disinfectant to massage into his paper-thin skin. $30 for real meals from the diner across the street, because the charity ward food was barely edible. Her mother called, confused about why the electric bill had not been paid. Emma lied, said there had been a mistake at the utility company, that she would handle it. The eviction notice gained a court date. Emma ignored it. She bought Richard flowers from the bodega on the corner, bright yellow daisies that Margaret had loved. He told her once in a morphine-soft voice. She placed them in a plastic water pitcher because there were no vases. And Richard cried silent tears that tracked down his hollow cheeks. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered. Emma took his trembling hand. "Because someone should." Richard waited until the night shift had begun, when the charity ward fell into its restless quiet, broken only by distant monitors and muffled coughs from neighboring rooms. He had asked Emma to stay after her shift ended, his voice carrying an urgency that frightened her. She sat in the plastic chair that had become hers through countless hours of vigil, watching him gather strength for whatever he needed to say. His hands shook worse than usual as he reached for the water cup, and Emma guided it to his lips with practiced gentleness. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper but carried the weight of a decision long considered. "Emma, I need to ask you something. Something unusual." She leaned closer, concerned. "What is it, Richard? Are you in pain? Should I call Dr. Winters?" He shook his head, managed something close to a smile. "No medication can help what ails me now. I want to ask you to marry me." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp. Emma blinked, certain she had misheard, that exhaustion had finally broken her mind. "I'm sorry, what?" Richard's pale eyes held hers steadily despite the tremor in his body. "I'm asking you to marry me. Not for romance, understand. I'm far past such things, but for practical reasons that might help us both." Emma opened her mouth, closed it, found no words adequate to the strangeness of this moment. Richard continued, his speech coming in short bursts between labored breaths. "I have a small pension from my working years, union benefits. As my widow, you would receive them. Not much, but perhaps enough to help with your mother's care. Your debts, I know you're drowning, Emma. I see it every day." Tears blurred Emma's vision. "Richard, I can't possibly. I have nothing left but my name," he interrupted gently, "and I would like someone good to have it. Someone who showed kindness without expectation of reward. Let me do this one last meaningful thing before I go. Let me give you what little I can." Emma's mind reeled, spinning through the impossibility of what he was suggesting, the desperate logic of it, the sheer, overwhelming strangeness of marrying a dying man she had known for barely 3 weeks. Yet she could not deny the truth. She was drowning, had been drowning for years, and here was someone offering a lifeline fashioned from his final breath. Emma said yes on a Wednesday morning after a sleepless night spent staring at her mother's pill bottles lined up on the kitchen counter like soldiers in a losing battle. She said yes, thinking of the eviction court date circled in red on her calendar. She said yes because sometimes survival requires accepting kindness in its strangest forms, and because the man offering had already given her something more valuable than money. He had seen her, truly seen her, when the rest of the world looked straight through. The courthouse ceremony took place on Friday afternoon. Richard had insisted on getting dressed, though the effort left him gasping, and Emma had helped him into a shirt that hung loose on his wasted frame. She wore the same blue dress she had worn to nursing school graduation, the hem slightly frayed but clean. They stood before a bored clerk, who rushed through the vows as though reading a grocery list, a janitor pulled from the hallway serving as their witness. Richard's hand shook violently as he signed the marriage certificate, his signature a trembling line that looked like the readout from a seismograph measuring distant earthquakes. Emma signed beneath his name, and just like that, she became Mrs. Emma Thornton. The strangeness of it washed over her in waves. This was not how she had imagined marriage during those girlhood nights when she had dreamed of white dresses and dancing and forever. Yet Richard seemed peaceful, a calmness settling over his features that she had not seen before, as though he had completed some essential task that had long weighed upon his conscience. They returned to the hospital in the taxi Emma could not afford but paid for anyway. Richard went back to room 317. Emma went back to work. The news spread through the hospital with the speed of infection. By Monday morning, every nurse on every floor knew that Emma Clarke had married the dying charity case from 317. Jessica laughed openly at the nurse's station. "A gold digger for fool's gold. What did you get, Emma? His collection of hospital gowns?" Sarah's voice dripped with mock sympathy. "I hope that pension is worth it, though I hear those union benefits barely cover a cup of coffee these days." Emma kept her head down, her hand moving mechanically as she updated charts. Her new wedding band, a simple silver thing that Richard had produced from some hidden pocket, catching the fluorescent light. Let them laugh. Let them judge. She was Mrs. Thornton now, and somehow that felt like armor against a world that had been crushing her slowly beneath its indifferent weight. Married life, such as it was, unfolded in the confines of room 317. Emma brought a few belongings from the apartment she could no longer afford. A change of clothes in a duffel bag, her mother's photograph in a simple frame, the deck of cards her father had left behind before he disappeared when she was 12. She tucked these items into the narrow closet beside Richard's single set of spare pajamas. And the act of sharing space, however small, felt unexpectedly intimate. Between shifts, she sat beside his bed and they played gin rummy. His hands so unsteady that she often had to help him hold his cards, their fingers touching in moments that felt both tender and heartbreaking. She read to him from library books she borrowed during her lunch breaks, stories of far-off places and grand adventures that took them both away from the sterile hospital walls. Richard listened with his eyes closed, but she knew he heard every word by the way he smiled at particularly beautiful passages or nodded at moments of truth. He began telling her stories too, cryptic tales that seemed to carry weight beyond their simple surface. He spoke of buildings that took years to construct, foundations that had to be laid deep and true or everything above would crumble. He talked about legacy, about creating things that outlasted the hands that made them. "The hard part," he said one evening as rain streaked the window, "is knowing what will endure. Money crumbles. Power fades. But kindness, Emma, kindness builds something that time cannot touch." She noticed things about him that did not fit the profile of a forgotten charity case. His vocabulary was expansive, peppered with references to literature and history that suggested extensive education. The way he spoke about architecture and business revealed knowledge too specific to be casual. Once, when Dr. Winters made a decision about pain medication, Richard questioned the dosage with medical precision that made the doctor pause and reconsider. Emma filed these observations away like puzzle pieces that did not quite form a coherent picture, but she was too tired and too focused on keeping him comfortable to pursue the inconsistencies. He was her husband now, this dying man with secrets in his eyes, and whatever he had been before mattered less than who he was in these final days. Hers to care for, hers to sit beside, hers to help across the threshold between this world and whatever waited beyond. The small revelations accumulated like snow, each flake insignificant alone but together, forming something that should have captured Emma's attention if exhaustion had not dulled her ability to see patterns. Richard knew the hospital in ways that puzzled her. When she mentioned that the third-floor supply closet had been reorganized, he frowned and said the old system had been more efficient, then described that system in detail despite never having left the charity ward. When a pipe burst in the east wing, flooding 2 patient rooms, Richard nodded knowingly and muttered something about warning them the plumbing was original to the building, installed in 1973 and overdue for replacement. How did a charity patient know when the plumbing had been installed? He knew names too, names of doctors who never visited the charity ward, senior physicians who worked in the private wings where wealthy patients recovered in rooms that looked like hotel suites. Dr. Harrison from cardiology, Dr. Chen from oncology, even the chief of surgery, Dr. Reynolds, whose office was in the administrative tower. Richard spoke of them not as distant authorities but with the casual familiarity of someone who had known them for years, who had attended their weddings or watched their children grow. Emma found the photograph by accident while searching for Richard's extra blanket in the narrow closet. It had slipped from the pocket of the coat hanging there, a single faded image that fluttered to the floor like a fallen leaf. She picked it up, studied it in the dim light. A younger Richard, perhaps 20 years past, standing before the hospital's main entrance, wearing an expensive suit, his arm around a beautiful woman with kind eyes who must have been Margaret. A ribbon stretched across the entrance behind them, and Richard held oversized scissors, captured in the moment before cutting. A dedication ceremony, perhaps, or a grand opening, but why would a charity patient have such a photograph? Emma turned it over, found nothing written on the back. No explanation for the incongruity. She should have asked him about it, should have demanded to know why nothing about him made sense. Instead, she tucked the photograph back into the coat pocket and returned to his bedside with the blanket, draping it over his shivering form with hands that knew only how to give comfort, her mind too focused on his labored breathing to chase mysteries that seemed less important than keeping him warm through another difficult night. Richard collapsed on a Tuesday morning, his breathing suddenly more desperate than labored, his lips turning blue as his weakened heart struggled to pump blood through a system that was shutting down. Emma was changing his IV when his eyes rolled back. When the monitors began their terrible screaming. When she realized with the clarity of her training that he was dying right now, not in days or weeks but in minutes if something was not done. Dr. Winters arrived, assessed, made the call that would haunt Emma for hours afterward. Richard needed emergency surgery, a procedure to drain fluid, crushing his lungs, to buy him perhaps weeks more instead of the minutes he had left. But the surgery was expensive, risky, and Dr. Winters shook his head before Emma could even ask. He has no insurance, no means to pay. The hospital won't approve it. Emma felt the world tilt sideways. He's dying. Right now. You're telling me you'll just let him die because of money? Dr. Winters looked uncomfortable but firm. I don't make these decisions, Emma. Talk to administration. She ran through the corridors, still wearing her scrubs, burst into the administrative offices, where Mr. Hendricks sat behind his desk, like a judge presiding over life and death, with nothing but a calculator for wisdom. She begged. She pleaded. She offered to work double shifts for years if they would just save him. Just give him this one chance. Mr. Hendricks listened with the expression of someone hearing an argument he had dismissed before the speaker even began. Mrs. Thornton, I sympathize. But this hospital cannot provide $30,000 surgeries to charity cases. We have protocols. We have budgets. We have accountability to our stakeholders. Emma's voice broke. He's my husband. He's a human being. Doesn't that matter? Hendricks sighed. The only way this surgery gets approved is by the hospital board, and they meet once a month. The next meeting is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Richard had minutes. Emma felt something inside her shatter. A helplessness so complete it was suffocating. She thought of everything she had tried to do, every kindness she had shown, and realized that in the face of institutional indifference, her love meant nothing at all. She walked back to room 317 on legs that barely held her, preparing to watch her husband die because the world valued money more than mercy. Emma could not accept it, could not simply sit beside Richard and watch him slip away without one final, desperate attempt. She stormed back through the corridors toward administration, her vision blurred with tears, her mind racing through arguments she had not yet made, pleas she had not yet voiced. She would beg on her knees if necessary. She would promise anything, everything, if they would just save him. The administrative wing was decorated differently than the rest of the hospital, carpeted and painted in warm colors meant to comfort wealthy donors and board members who never ventured into places like the charity ward. Emma barely noticed as she rushed past the secretary's desk, heading again for Hendricks' office. But something caught her eye, made her stop mid-stride, made her turn slowly toward the wall where portraits hung in expensive frames. The largest portrait, positioned at the center in a place of honor, showed a man in his late 50s, silver hair immaculately styled, wearing a suit that cost more than Emma's annual salary, standing before the hospital's main entrance with an expression of quiet pride and unmistakable authority. Below the portrait, a brass plaque read, Richard Thornton, founder and chairman emeritus, Mercy General Hospital. Emma stared at the portrait, her mind refusing to process what her eyes clearly saw. The face was unmistakable despite the 20 pounds of healthy weight, despite the color in his cheeks, despite the confidence that illness had stolen. Richard. Her Richard. The dying charity patient from room 317. The man she had married thinking he had nothing. The secretary appeared at Emma's elbow, her voice shaking. Mrs. Thornton? That's your husband? Richard Thornton is your husband? Emma could not speak, could not breathe, could only stare as the world rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. The secretary continued, words tumbling out in shock. He checked himself into the charity ward 6 weeks ago. Refused to use his real identity. Refused all his privileges. The board has been frantic, but he left explicit instructions that he was not to be disturbed, that he wanted to be treated like any other patient without means. The hospital did not just employ Richard Thornton. He owned it, had built it, had funded it. The dying man she had brought soup and played cards with, the man she had married for his modest pension, was one of the wealthiest men in the entire state, and he had been testing the world from the charity ward, waiting to see if anyone would care about a man who appeared to have nothing left to give. Emma returned to room 317, moving like someone underwater. Each step requiring conscious effort, her mind still struggling to reconcile the dying man in the charity ward bed with the powerful figure in the portrait. Richard's breathing had stabilized slightly, the immediate crisis passing, but his eyes were open, and watching her approach with an expression that told her he knew. Somehow he knew that she had discovered the truth. She pulled the plastic chair close to his bedside, sat down carefully, and took his trembling hand in hers with the same gentleness she had always shown him, because despite everything, he was still dying, still suffering, still the man she had sat beside for weeks. The portrait in the administrative wing, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to break through. That's you. You own this hospital. Richard's eyes filled with tears that tracked slowly down his hollow cheeks. Yes. Emma waited, giving him time to gather strength for explanation, her heart splitting between anger at deception and grief at understanding why. Richard's voice came in whispers between labored breaths. After Margaret died, everything changed. People who had ignored us for years suddenly remembered my name. Friends appeared who wanted investments. Family members I had not seen in decades needed loans. Charities called daily. Everyone wanted something, Emma. Everyone saw the money, not the man. I became invisible behind my wealth. He paused, coughing, and Emma helped him sip water before he continued. I wanted to know if anyone would care about Richard Thornton the man, not Richard Thornton the billionaire. So I checked myself into the charity ward under false pretenses. I wanted to see if kindness still existed in a world that had taught me to expect only greed. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. 43 days I waited. Nurses came and went. Doctors treated my symptoms without seeing my soul. And then you walked in, stayed past your shift, brought me soup, sat with me when you should have been resting. You gave everything when you had nothing, expected nothing in return. You restored my faith in humanity, Emma. You showed me that goodness still exists. Emma felt her carefully constructed composure cracking. Part of her wanted to be angry, wanted to feel manipulated and used. But looking at his face, seeing the desperate loneliness that had driven him to such extreme measures, she found she could not summon rage, only profound sadness for a man so wealthy he had to pretend to be poor, to find authenticity in a world that had forgotten how to see him. Richard gathered his strength over the next hour, and Emma sat in silence, holding his hand while the full story emerged in fragments between fits of coughing and moments when pain made speech impossible. He and Margaret had built Mercy General from nothing. Two young idealists who believed healthcare should be a right, not a privilege, who had mortgaged everything they owned to break ground on a small community clinic that grew over decades into the sprawling medical complex it was today. Their only child, a daughter named Sarah, had died at 16 in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway, and that grief had nearly destroyed them both. But they had poured their anguish into the hospital, into saving other people's children, into creating something meaningful from their unbearable loss. Then 7 years ago, Margaret had felt the lump in her breast, and despite all the money, all the best doctors, all the cutting-edge treatments their hospital could provide, the cancer had won. She had died in a private suite on the 6th floor, and Richard had held her hand just as Emma now held his. Helpless against the enemy they had spent their lives fighting. After Margaret's death, Richard withdrew from the world, became bitter and suspicious, saw greed in every friendly gesture and calculation in every kind word. He tested people, gave them opportunities to show their true nature. And they failed him again and again. Board members who praised his vision while trying to manipulate company stock. Supposed friends who borrowed money they never repaid. A nephew who visited once asking for funds to start a business that existed only in imagination. Even the clergy who came speaking of God's plan while hinting at building campaigns that needed wealthy donors. Richard had grown tired of humanity. Tired of being seen as a walking bank account instead of a grieving widower who simply wanted someone to care whether he lived or died. He had checked himself into the charity ward expecting nothing, preparing to die alone and forgotten, convinced that his cynical view of human nature would be confirmed one final time. And then Emma had walked in, exhausted and broke and drowning in her own troubles. And she had stayed anyway, had given what she could not afford to give, and had married him thinking she was inheriting nothing but a name and a tiny pension. She had proven him wrong about everything. Emma left Richard's room after he had exhausted himself with confession and fell into restless sleep, walking through corridors that suddenly felt unfamiliar despite years of navigating them blindly. She could walk away. The marriage was barely a week old, performed under false pretenses, easily annulled. She owed nothing to a man who had lied to her, who had tested her like some character in a fairy tale, who had watched her struggle with bills and exhaustion while sitting on a fortune that could have solved her problems with a single phone call. The hospital had transformed around her in the hours since the truth emerged. Nurses who had mocked her now smiled with sickening sweetness, asking if she needed anything, offering to cover her shifts, suddenly interested in her opinions about hospital policy. Mr. Hendricks appeared in the hallway, his earlier coldness replaced by obsequious warmth, assuring her that Richard's surgery was already scheduled, that the finest surgical team was being assembled, that cost was no object whatsoever. Dr. Winters apologized profusely for any misunderstanding, praised her dedication to her husband, suggested she might want to take a leave of absence to focus on family. The transformation was grotesque. A perfect illustration of everything Richard had described. People seeing wealth instead of humanity, bowing before money rather than character. Emma felt nauseated by it all, disgusted by how quickly indifference turned to fawning attention, how easily compassion could be purchased with the revelation of a bank account. She sat in the hospital chapel, empty at this hour, and forced herself to examine her own heart with the same brutal honesty Richard had shown in his confession. Was she angry at the deception? Yes. Did she feel manipulated? Absolutely. But beneath that anger, beneath that sense of betrayal, lay a truth she could not deny. Her feelings for Richard had been real. She had not fallen in love with him. Not in the romantic sense. But she had come to care deeply for the frail, lonely man in room 317, who listened to her troubles and played cards with trembling hands and cried when she brought him flowers. That man was real, regardless of the money, regardless of the empire he had built. The Richard who needed her was not the billionaire in the portrait, but the dying widower who had lost faith in humanity until a broke nurse showed him kindness without knowing there would be reward. Emma stood, her choice crystallizing into certainty. She walked back to room 317, pulled the plastic chair close to Richard's bedside, took his hand in hers, and stayed because he needed her, not because of what he owned, but because of who he was beneath everything the world had made him become. Richard's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next 48 hours, his body finally surrendering to the cancer that had been slowly consuming him for months. The crisis brought an army of specialists, the hospital's entire senior medical staff descending on room 317, like dignitaries arriving too late to prevent a disaster they should have seen coming. Dr. Reynolds, the chief of surgery who had never once visited the charity ward, suddenly appeared with a team of residents, discussing treatment options in loud, confident voices that filled the small room with noise and authority. Cardiologists consulted with pulmonologists who conferred with oncologists, everyone eager to demonstrate their expertise, to be part of saving Richard Thornton's life now that his identity was known. Emma stood against the wall watching this performance with growing disgust, seeing Richard's discomfort as strangers poked and prodded him, talked over him as though he were already gone. debated his fate while ignoring the fear in his eyes. She finally stepped forward, her voice cutting through the medical chatter with surprising force. "Everyone out! Now!" Dr. Reynolds turned, startled by her audacity. "Mrs. Thornton, we're trying to save your husband's life." Emma met his gaze steadily. "And I appreciate that, but he needs quiet, not a circus. Send me one doctor. Someone who will talk to both of us, not just perform for an audience." They left, reluctantly, leaving only Dr. Chen, the oncologist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes who had treated Margaret years ago. She explained the situation with gentle honesty. Richard needed a rare procedure, experimental, with only a 40% success rate in healthy patients and far lower odds given his age and weakened state. The surgery would take 8 hours, require a specialist flown in from Boston, and even if successful, would buy him months rather than years. Without it, he had perhaps 3 days. Emma was his spouse, his legal next of kin, and the decision was hers to make. She looked at Richard, saw him watching her with complete trust despite everything, despite the lies and tests and complications. He reached for her hand, squeezed weakly, and whispered 2 words that broke her heart and made her decision simultaneously. "Choose life." Emma signed the consent forms with shaking hands, authorizing a surgery that might kill him on the table, betting everything on the slim chance that kindness deserved more time in this world. The surgery was scheduled for the following morning, but complications emerged that evening when the hospital's head pharmacist appeared at Emma's side with news that drained what little hope she had managed to salvage from the wreckage of the past few days. The experimental medication required for the procedure was not covered by any standard formulary, cost $75,000, and needed to be secured immediately from a specialized pharmaceutical supplier in Switzerland. Emma stared at her, uncomprehending. "But Richard owns the hospital. Surely." The pharmacist shook her head apologetically. "That's the problem, Mrs. Thornton. We've been trying to access his accounts to cover the cost, but Mr. Thornton liquidated most of his accessible funds 3 months ago, donated everything to charity as part of his estate planning before he checked himself into the charity ward. His main assets are tied up in trusts and hospital holdings that require board approval to access, which takes weeks. We need the medication in 6 hours or we have to cancel the surgery." Emma felt the floor drop away beneath her feet. Richard had given away his fortune before testing the world, had entered the charity ward as genuinely broke as he appeared, and now his own generosity was killing him. The irony was suffocating. She thought of her mother's house, the small 2-bedroom bungalow in the decent part of town that her mother had signed over to Emma 2 years ago when the dementia made independent living impossible. Her only inheritance, her only asset, worth perhaps $80,000 if she could find a desperate buyer. Emma made 3 phone calls, the first to a real estate investor who specialized in quick cash purchases. The second to her mother's care facility, explaining through tears that the payment might be late this month. The third to the pharmacist, authorizing the wire transfer of $76,000, everything the investor would pay for immediate sale, her mother's house and her own future security, sacrificed for medication that might not even work. Richard never knew. He had slipped into unconsciousness an hour earlier, his body shutting down in preparation for either surgery or death. Emma sat beside him as the medication arrived, as the surgical team assembled, as they wheeled him away toward an operating room where his fate would be decided by doctors who had ignored him when they thought he was nobody. She had nothing left now except hope, and she clung to it with the same desperate grip she had used to hold his hand through all the nights when the world had forgotten he existed. The surgery lasted 11 hours, each minute stretching into eternity while Emma paced the surgical waiting room that had been transformed into a private suite for her comfort, leather chairs, and coffee service that she ignored completely, seeing only the clock on the wall marking time between life and death. When Dr. Chen finally emerged, still in surgical scrubs, her exhausted smile told Emma everything before words could. Richard had survived. Weak, damaged, barely clinging to life, but alive. He woke 3 days later in the intensive care unit. Emma asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still holding his despite unconsciousness. His voice, barely a whisper, pulled her from dreams of houses sold and futures unmade. She explained what had happened during the surgery, the complications overcome, the medication that had saved him. Richard listened quietly until she mentioned the cost. And then his eyes, still clouded with pain medication, sharpened with sudden understanding. Where did the money come from, Emma? She tried to deflect, to change the subject, but he pressed with the same intensity that had built a hospital empire. Where? Emma's voice broke as she confessed. Her mother's house, the quick sale, the sacrifice of her only inheritance and security. Richard's face crumpled, tears flowing freely down cheeks that had regained the slightest hint of color. His hand tightened around hers with more strength than she thought he possessed. You would have done that for me? Even knowing I had lied to you? Even knowing what I am? Emma nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Richard closed his eyes, his chest heaving with emotion that had nothing to do with surgical recovery. When he opened them again, his voice carried the authority that illness had masked but never truly stolen. Get my lawyers. Now. All of them. They arrived within hours, a team of attorneys in expensive suits crowding into the ICU with briefcases and tablets and the power to move mountains of money with signatures. Richard, propped against pillows and connected to machines monitoring his tenuous hold on life, began dictating changes with the clarity of someone who had finally remembered what truly mattered in this world, who had been given a second chance and refused to waste it on anything less than making things right with the one person who had proven that love still existed when stripped of every worldly incentive. The lawyers worked through the afternoon while Richard directed them with the same vision that had built Mercy General decades earlier, but this time his focus was not on expansion or profit, but on repairing the damage that cynicism and grief had carved into his soul. He established an irrevocable trust for Emma's mother, enough to cover every medical expense, every comfort, every need for the remainder of her life, in the finest care facility in the state. He created a second trust for Emma herself, funding for advanced education, for any degree or certification she wanted to pursue, for a future unburdened by the debt that had been drowning her since graduation. But these were afterthoughts, personal gestures that paled beside his true purpose. Richard's voice grew stronger as he outlined his vision for the Margaret Thornton Foundation for Compassionate Care, a permanent endowment that would transform how Mercy General treated its most vulnerable patients. The charity ward would be renovated, expanded, staffed with nurses who understood that dignity was not a luxury reserved for those who could pay. Every patient, regardless of insurance or income, would receive the same quality of care, the same respect, the same humanity that Emma had shown to a dying man in room 317. No one would be discharged because they could not afford treatment. No one would die alone because they appeared to have nothing. The foundation would train staff in compassion, reward kindness over efficiency, measure success not in profit margins, but in moments of genuine human connection. Emma listened to him describe this vision, watched the lawyers transcribe his words into legal documents that would outlast them both, and something shifted in her understanding of everything that had happened. This had never been about testing her for reward. Richard had not been searching for someone to leave his fortune to, but for proof that the world Margaret had believed in still existed, that the hospital they had built on principles of compassion had not become just another business measuring lives against spreadsheets. Emma's kindness had not earned her money. It had restored Richard's faith in humanity, had reminded him why he and Margaret had sacrificed everything to build a place where healing meant more than billing codes. And now he was using his wealth to ensure that faith could never be lost again. Richard's recovery defied every medical prediction, his body finding strength that doctors had declared impossible, as though having something meaningful to live for had rewritten the rules of terminal illness. 6 weeks after the surgery, he was walking the halls with a cane, stopping to talk with patients in the newly renovated charity wing that no longer felt like a place where the forgotten went to die. 8 weeks after, he attended his first board meeting in months. His physical frailty contrasted by the steel in his voice as he pushed through reforms that administrators had been blocking for years. Emma refused every offer of special treatment, every suggestion that she move into an office or take a supervisory role that would remove her from patient care. She still wore her scrubs, still worked the floor, still changed bedpans, and held the hands of the frightened and dying because that was who she was, and Richard's money could not change the fundamental nature of her calling. But now, Richard worked alongside her in ways that transformed the hospital from within. He shadowed her during rounds, taking notes on every inefficiency, every moment where bureaucracy prevented compassionate care. He sat with families in waiting rooms, listening to their frustrations, their fears, their stories of feeling invisible in a system designed around insurance codes rather than human needs. Together they became an unlikely team, the billionaire founder and the floor nurse, meeting every evening in what had once been his ICU room and was now an office they shared, planning changes that rippled through every department. Their marriage, born from practical necessity and mutual testing, evolved into something neither had anticipated. Not the passionate romance of youth, but the deep affection of two people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and chosen to stay anyway. Richard brought Emma coffee exactly as she liked it. Emma made sure he took his medications, scolded him when he pushed too hard, made him laugh with stories from the nursing station. Mercy General became a model for patient-centered care. Hospitals from across the country sending administrators to study how compassion could be systematized without losing authenticity, how profit and humanity could coexist when leadership believed in both. The Margaret Thornton Foundation funded dozens of similar programs nationwide, spreading the lesson that a dying man had learned in room 317, that kindness without expectation of reward was not weakness, but the strongest foundation upon which to build anything meant to last. 6 months had rewritten their story from tragedy into something neither had dared imagine during those desperate nights in room 317. Richard had gained back 20 pounds, his cheeks no longer hollow, his hands steady enough to hold a coffee cup without trembling, his body still fragile, but recovering in ways that made Dr. Chen shake her head in wonder and revise her textbook understanding of terminal prognosis. Emma was finishing her advanced degree in nursing administration, attending classes 2 evenings a week that Richard had encouraged despite her protests that she loved bedside care. His gentle insistence that she could do both, could lead while never forgetting what she had learned from the patients who had shaped her calling. The Margaret Thornton Foundation had expanded beyond hospital reform to support caregivers themselves, providing scholarships for nursing students drowning in debt, grants for home health aides struggling to survive on minimum wage, respite care for family members sacrificing everything to care for dying loved ones, recognizing that those who gave compassion professionally often had no one caring for them in return. Emma's mother was thriving in Willowbrook Gardens, the finest memory care facility in 3 states, participating in art therapy that brought moments of clarity through the fog of dementia, asking after Emma's husband during visits, not always remembering his name but always smiling when he came along. On a Tuesday afternoon, Richard walked through the main entrance of Mercy General with his cane, past the portrait that no longer seemed to represent who he truly was, taking the elevator not to the executive floor but to the 3rd-floor nursing station where Emma stood updating charts between patient visits. The other nurses smiled, not with the sickening false warmth of those first days after the revelation, but with genuine affection for the couple who had reminded them all why they had chosen healthcare as a profession. Richard brought Emma lunch from the diner across the street, the same sandwiches she had once purchased with quarters saved from skipped meals, and they ate together in the break room like any married couple stealing moments during busy days. He was not there as the owner, not as the founder, not as the billionaire whose name graced the building, but simply as her husband, the man who had found unexpected love in the most unprecedented circumstances, who had learned that the greatest wealth was being seen for who you truly were and being loved anyway. So, what can we learn from Emma and Richard's extraordinary journey? Their story is not just about a nurse and a billionaire, not just about deception and revelation, but about something far more fundamental to what it means to be human in a world that too often measures worth in dollar signs instead of character. Emma Clarke walked into room 317 with nothing but her compassion, her integrity, and her willingness to see a dying man as worthy of dignity, regardless of what he could offer in return. She gave when she had nothing to give, loved when there was no logical reason to love, sacrificed when sacrifice seemed foolish. And in doing so, she proved to a man who had lost faith in humanity that authentic kindness still exists. That some people still choose goodness not because of what they might receive, but because of who they choose to be. Richard Thornton learned the hardest lesson of all. That love cannot be found through testing, but only through trust. That by disguising himself as poor, he discovered the richest truth of his life, that the woman who married him for a modest pension was worth more than all the wealth he had accumulated in a lifetime of building empires. Emma learned that integrity cannot be bought or sold. That the values she held when she thought Richard was nobody remained unchanged when she discovered he was somebody. That her character was not for sale at any price. True wealth is not counted in bank accounts or stock portfolios or hospital empires. True wealth is found in the moments of genuine human connection. In the hands that hold yours when you are dying. In the sacrifice made without expectation of reward. In the love that sees past all the masks we wear to the frightened, lonely, hopeful souls we all carry inside. The next time you encounter someone who appears to have nothing, remember Emma. The next time you feel alone despite your success, remember Richard. Choose kindness, not because of what it might bring you, but because kindness is its own reward. Because compassion is the only currency that appreciates with use, because in the end, we are all just fragile human beings searching for someone who will care whether we live or die. If this story touched your heart, if Emma and Richard's journey reminded you of what truly matters, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message today, and subscribe to see more stories that celebrate the power of authentic human goodness in a world that desperately needs reminding.